Listen and remember that what follows is not for the faint of spirit. I speak to you like a mentor who has seen the bottom of human possibility and returned to warn you. In the swamps near Shreveport in 1905, a family perfected a system so efficient it made nightmares ordinary. They did not act from madness but from calculation and survival hardened into doctrine. Imagine wagons abandoned in mud, harnessed horses, personal items left untouched, as if the road swallowed people whole. Then imagine a family whose silence hides an industrial slaughterhouse where meat is classified and salted for sale. They called their operation necessity family business. They called victims a resource and taught children to taste and judge like butchers. This opening is the map into that ruined moral landscape where isolation bred method and method became empire. You will learn names that history tried to turn into whispers. You will learn how grooming became training and ritual. The matriarch Clemens drew plans with the calm of a manager and the cruelty of someone who sees only utility in flesh. She and Cordelia moved like architects of a new order, assigning roles to young and old, teaching twins to clean bones and scouts to lure travelers. They manipulated trust using small mercies, water for thirsty horses, directions for lost couples, a blanket in cold rain. When strangers accepted those offers, they stepped into choreography designed to erase them cleanly. The family studied butchery with a craftsman eye. They labeled cuts by age, sex, texture, fat content as if composing a market catalog. They preserved half of each harvest and sold the rest in town in barrels and smokehouses, their meat praised for tenderness by unsuspecting buyers. A priest named Gilbert found toys and buttons in a doll stained in soft earth, and he reported the smell, the objects, the pattern. A sheriff named Landry organized a team with dogs and dread and uncovered bones with precise saw marks mixed with animal remains, confirmation that turned rumor into legal horror. This is where the story tightens and the mentor voice warns that evil can wear the face of enterprise and habit. We will descend deeper into their rooms, ledgers, catalogs, and into the children raised to prefer human flesh over animal meat. Understand now that the swamp hides not only water but a lesson about how ordinary needs can be perverted into systems of atrocity. Prepare to walk further into the shadow and hold your breath while we pull the curtain on what a family called survival and called it skill. Remember this lesson and guard your conscience with fierce vigilance. Today, Sheriff Augustus Landry gathered men who had seen storms and blood and still believed the world made sense when law walked into the dark. He carried a warrant and the weight of names that needed answers. They moved through cypress and knee-deep mud with dogs whose noses tightened at the air. The property held silence like a held breath, and the trees seemed to lean away as if ashamed to witness what lay beneath. Landry announced himself and the family broke into practiced chaos like an animal troop scattering at a flash of light. Men bolted doors and shoved crates into corners while children vanished between cabins as if swallowed by the structure that protected them. The first shed opened like the throat of a butcher, and the sight seized the breath from the men who had walked into murder disguised as routine. Tables caked in dried blood and hooks that had held bodies hung with the echo of motion that made stomachs turn. Knives adapted from farm tools lay arranged with the care of instruments groomed by habit. Barrels of salt sat in rows and racks of smoke held strips of meat cured with a practiced hand. Labels and fading ink named types and ages with blunt practicality that ridiculed any plea of necessity. Pits in the swamp kept a mixture of bone and refuse, and the scent that rose was both sweet and metallic. Dr. Manning cataloged bones and spoke in clinical terms that could not erase the horror the men felt in their hands. Cut marks told of hands that knew anatomy and a rhythm familiar to anyone who worked meat. The evidence told a story of scale, a system designed to feed bodies and markets without noise. It was criminal enterprise and domestic ritual merged into one practice. When they brought Clemens before the table, she smiled like a captain whose ship had docked with profit in the hold. She explained methods with the calm of a market woman teaching a younger hand how to cure meat. Cordelia corrected terms as if lecturing, and the children answered with the flat precision of trained witnesses. The sheriff felt the ground tilt under his feet, not from fear of violence but from the unnatural normality of the family voice. They had traded empathy for efficiency and sewn that trade into a code passed across generations. Every ledger tool and note repeated the same pattern until repetition made atrocities seem ordinary. Landry left that day knowing the world had altered in a place he had thought secure, and that caution now belonged to every man on those roads. Remember this when you travel alone in country. The courtroom became a theater where civilization tried to name what had been made ordinary by secrecy and craft. Voices rose and fell, but the twins of that swamp were not the only ones on trial. The town had been judged too, and the rural habit of trusting strange hospitality stood accused. Witnesses spoke with voices knotted by grief, and jurors tried to hold reason against images that refused to soften. Clemens sat with a posture that suggested business, not repentance, and Cordelia guided testimony like an instructor correcting an apprentice. The evidence was a litany of repeated practice of method and economy. Ledgers catalogued victims while notebooks recorded yield, quality, and preferred cuts. A butcher's ledger in a child hand lay next to toys made of bone, and the contrast stunned people into silence. Medical reports from Dr. Manning described bone markings as efficient as any professional abattoir, and the language of science only sharpened the horror. Outside the courthouse, crowds pressed like weather, and men exchanged stories that hardened into legend as quickly as fear. Reporters scribbled shorthand that would translate into headlines, and the melody of the words made the truth both public and unreal. Prosecutors stood with calm determination, turning records into charges, and the legal machine of the county began its slow, inevitable work. They parsed motive, means, and method, and the pattern was unmistakable. This was not impulsive savagery but sustained enterprise. Defense counsel tried arguments about madness, about long-term isolation, about broken lineage, and the jury listened as men who had to choose a definition of moral responsibility. They considered not only the acts but the system that created them, and the comfortable moral assumptions that allowed neighbors to look away. Questions appeared about culpability and about whether children molded from infancy could be held to adult standards. Experts debated conditioning and genetic devastation, and the public followed every nuance like men watching a storm gather. The judge read statutes and the sentences stacked like facts, while families in the gallery tried to sip small fragments of closure. When verdicts landed, they did not restore the missing nor heal the broken bodies recovered from the soil. They marked only legal recognition and the beginning of containment. The matriarch received judgment with the same reserved certainty that had guided her life, as if law was another market to which she would adjust. Watching from the benches were men who would no longer travel alone on thin roads, and women who would teach their sons to be cautious with hospitality. The trial became a public ritual of naming and separation, while the swamp beyond kept its mute witness, and the lesson stays: what follows is an anatomy of slow decay, where habit becomes doctrine and doctrine becomes industry of cruelty. Listen as I map the mechanism that turned kinship into an apparatus for survival and commerce. The Brousard clan refined roles, training, and rituals until every hand knew its task without question. Children learned trades in bone and flesh as others learned to read or mend plows. Their notebooks catalogued victims like ledgers registering yields and expenses. They developed categories for flesh as if seasoning and texture required classification. In that swamp economy, morality receded behind practicality, and the family practiced what it called stewardship of resources. Observe how isolation functions like pressure applied to soft metal, shaping it into a new form that will hold under strain. Generations of inbreeding produced minds and bodies primed to obey a lineage that valued continuity over conscience. Old stories about ancestors became operational manuals, and the past supplied not memory but method. Understand that the Broussards did not invent cruelty, they cultivated it into competence and normalized atrocity through repetition. Once a practice is taught to children as apprenticeship, it loses its barbaric sheen and becomes mere work. This is the danger of ritual and routine performed without moral check. Notice how they exploited common expectations of Southern hospitality and used trust as a hinge to open victims into the machine. A lost traveler accepts water and directions, then finds himself catalogued as product by hands that have learned to be efficient. The family preserved meat with salt, smoke, and barrels, and rotated inventory with businesslike care. They tasted, judged, labeled, and sold, while merchants praised a texture that hid a crime. Their confidence came from learning how to make the world look ordinary while devouring it from within. The priest Gilbert set a moral trap by following scent and soil, and his discovery shifted rumor to evidence that demanded action. Sheriff Landry then learned a hard lesson about how crimes can exist inside customs and how the familiar can conceal the grotesque. The legal pursuit exposed not only bodies but the mechanisms by which isolation hides wrongs. It asked deeper questions about culpability conditioning and the limits of responsibility for children raised within a normalized atrocity. But history at its rawest is a ledger of human choices, and the Brousard ledger read like an indictment of priorities turned deadly. Keep this in mind: the line between survival and atrocity can be crossed in small steps, step by step, until the mind no longer perceives the distance between them. This is a lesson in vigilance and moral clarity that men refuse at their peril. Hold this truth and act before complacency consumes. The swamp taught lessons in silence and concealment, lessons the family converted into habit and machine. They learned to map routes where wagons would be abandoned, to choose crossroads where no neighbor would notice a missing family. They trained scouts to read travelers like men read weather, to note the weight of a wagon, the extra blankets for children, the way a couple spoke of their planned arrival. Each disappearance followed choreography, a stage direction practiced until muscle memory replaced conscience. Observe how the family weaponized friendliness, turning small courtesies into traps that disarmed suspicion. A request to help with a wheel, a shared flask, directions whispered behind a hand, all gestures designed to lower guard and open trust. When a family accepted hospitality, they stepped into a process that had been rehearsed for years. The attack moved like a swarm, precise and brief, aimed to silence and to preserve flesh. Bodies were brought to sheds where the work began with a discipline that mocked mercy. Processing followed methods refined to both preserve quality and to remove evidence: salt curing, smoking, labeling, rotation of stock. They recorded yields and preferences with an arithmetic that reduced humans to units and cuts. Consider how the merchant who praised their product became an unwitting partner, how commerce can wash a crime in routine exchange. Power shifted because everyday markets provided cover, and because men who profit rarely ask about origin. Look at the children trained to taste and judge, their palates shaped toward a cuisine of survival, their language stripped of horror. They spoke of quality, of texture, of the best pieces for the city buyer, with the same pride as any farmer. This is the deepest betrayal, the conversion of human appetite into a tool of domination. Father Gilbert followed a trail until soil surrendered trinkets, until a doll spoke of absence, and then the law moved. But the law met another lesson: the swamp resists neat closure, hiding pits and paths that swallow tracks. When men attempted to surround the property, people escaped into water and reed, dissolving into a landscape they had long mastered. Capture became partial, and some fugitives vanished into reed and river. Yet the evidence in sheds and pits was absolute: bones counted, cut marks catalogued, ledgers read like confessions. The mind struggles to hold such methodical depravity, to see organized process where one expects chaos. This is the dangerous insight: human systems can normalize atrocity through routine, slowing horror into habit until it requires removal by law. Remember this and act as we continue the descent into how an enterprise of death functions by the logic of efficiency rather than the impulse of madness. This is the chamber where childhood was overwritten and taste became training. The Brousard children learned ceremonies of hunger and rituals of preservation that erased moral cues. They were taught to hate the outsider as easily as they were taught to recognize the best cut. Each morning began with measurements and tasks assigned with factory precision. Children cleaned hooks or tended smoke until their hands understood the scent of cured flesh. Lessons were oral and visual, not taught with books but with demonstration and enforced repetition. When a child hesitated, a stern glance or a swift lash returned motion to the correct pattern. Observe how conditioning works in slow increments, a handful of rehearsals becoming a lifetime of reflex. They learned culinary vocabulary that mapped directly onto victims' palate, age categories, texture grades, and preparation styles. A youngster could describe the difference between a youth and a laborer by muscle tone and fat distribution. These were not idle observations but practical classifications used to determine market value. The family taught children to skin, to separate, to salt, and to label as if they were apprentices in a trade guild. Play became practice and toys were reshaped into pedagogical tools made from scraps of bone and leather to normalize the act. Doctors later documented the psychological imprinting that marked the children. Dr. Manning recorded flattened affect, limited empathy, and a narrowed moral imagination. Medical reports noted stunted development, facial asymmetries, and cognitive delays consistent with generations of inbreeding and with extreme social conditioning. The children would repeat phrases learned at the table: meat is meat and family is family, as though reciting catechism. This linguistic reinforcement closed moral space and made atrocity grammatically neutral. Notice how language morphs into authority when spoken by elders and practiced by those without alternatives. They learned secrecy, two codes of silence that turned witnesses into insiders and silence into protection. Rings of complicity formed around the family doctrine. At market, the eldest would present meat with an assured smile while the youngest watched for recognition or threat in the buyer eye. The transaction completed the cycle and normalized commerce built on atrocity. Consider the ethical fracture that follows when abuse is both livelihood and legacy. Those who profited from purchases contributed unwittingly to the perpetuation of the practice. The priest and the sheriff uncovered physical evidence, but the deeper crime was cultural, a system that taught children to devour humanity without shame. This is the real horror that turns ordinary men into carriers of atrocity and ordinary communities into zones of risk. Keep watching as we go further into how markets and morals collided to make the Brousard operation possible and history remembers. Step with me now into the economics of this hidden enterprise and see how a swamp-born lineage learned to manipulate hunger markets and secrecy as if they were levers of power. Every crime they committed survived not only because of isolation but because of demand, because the merchants of nearby towns valued tenderness and flavor more than curiosity. The Brousard clan understood this truth with frightening clarity, and they built a quiet empire by supplying what buyers praised without asking questions. They salted, cured, smoked, and packed their product in barrels marked with harmless symbols like farm initials or seasonal batches, and every merchant who purchased from them became a piece of cover. Understand how commerce becomes camouflage when the product is desirable and the seller is charming enough to distract from the uneasy feeling that something is off. The family used scarcity to command prices, especially during harsh winters when livestock died and hunters failed, and men with cold hands and hungry mouths would pay for anything rich and filling. Clemens taught her children how to negotiate trading cuts for tools, flour, bullets, and sometimes even information about travelers heading through the region. This is how the enterprise expanded. The family listened, learned, and planned as if running a quiet intelligence network. The Brousards understood leverage and used it well. They exploited the rhythm of rural life, knowing when travelers moved, when merchants restocked, when storms isolated roads. Every cycle fed the machine, and every exchange tightened their grasp on the local economy. Consider how the buyers shared glowing remarks praising the flavor and softness and recommending the family product to others. Each compliment worked like an advertisement, spreading their reach while masking their source. See how corruption can grow without malice, simply through appetite, convenience, and silence. Merchants did not want to believe rumors because disbelief protected the comfort of their trade. The line between suspicion and denial blurred quickly when profit entered the conversation. This is how systems of horror persist, not through open violence but through a marketplace that prefers not to look beneath the lid of a barrel. The sheriff later remarked that when he inspected the smokehouse he realized he had eaten from these racks months before, and the memory almost broke his resolve. This revelation reveals the depth of infiltration, how a single family had fed an entire region without ever declaring their true harvest. Their ledger listed names of buyers, weights of shipments, and notes on which stores moved product fastest. These details showed that the clan was not merely surviving but thriving, manipulating supply chains like seasoned traders. Understand this lesson: power hides best inside what people need most: food, trust, familiarity. As we descend deeper, you will see how hunger is never just appetite, it is vulnerability, and those who master that vulnerability can dominate entire communities. Prepare your mind, the next stage is darker and shows how the clan protected its empire through fear, rumor, and the shaping of local belief. Now descend into the mind of a community that lived beside a monster yet refused to see its face. Understand this truth, viewer: most horrors do not survive by force, they survive by shaping the thoughts of the people nearby, bending perception until truth becomes inconvenient noise. The Brousard clan never needed to silence townsfolk because they mastered something far more effective. They planted fear wrapped in folklore and let the locals police themselves. For years strange disappearances were whispered across the parishes, but every whisper ended the same way, with someone shrugging and muttering swamp spirits or wandering drifters or hungry gators, and the conversation died before it ever lived. This was not ignorance, it was conditioning. The family understood human psychology in a primal, instinctive way. If people believe the land itself is dangerous, they never look for a human threat hiding inside it. Clemens encouraged the mythology-telling merchants stories of marsh ghosts that trapped travelers and beasts that dragged wagons into the mud, and townsfolk repeated those stories like hymns. Fear created distance, and distance protected the clan. But they did more than spread legend. They strategically manipulated the community's trust structures. Whenever a family went missing, Cordelia would appear in town offering sympathy and assistance, visiting vigils, suggesting search routes, and performing grief with a sincerity that fooled even the most hardened men. Think about that viewer, the killer attending the ceremony of the killed, guiding the search for people she had already processed in her own shed. This is power, not just cruelty. This is psychological warfare sharpened over generations. The clan also learned to mimic poverty, because nothing blinds a community faster than assuming someone has nothing worth hiding. They dressed simply, spoke softly, carried themselves with the humility of struggling farmers, and the townsfolk saw what they expected to see. Perception became armor. Even the children played a role, wandering into town with nervous smiles, repeating lines they had been trained to say about hard winters and empty stomachs. People pitied them, and pity is one of the strongest shields a predator can wear. But beneath this performance was a deeper mechanism, a rotating system of visibility. They ensured only certain members interacted with outsiders, while others never left the property, crafting an illusion of a small, harmless household. The full scale of their hidden workforce remained invisible. And when hunters or trappers occasionally ventured too close to the property, the family used intimidation rituals they had perfected. Rustling branches, staged animal cries, sudden warnings shouted in French from unseen places. The goal was simple: push outsiders back into familiar paths before curiosity could bloom. Understand this, viewer: systems of manipulation do not rely on charisma alone. They rely on predictable behaviors, fear patterns, and emotional triggers. The Brousards mapped their community's psychology like hunters studying the habits of prey. As we continue this descent, you will see how the structure collapsed when one man finally refused to accept the stories and look directly at the truth buried beneath the soil. Now witness the moment when silence began to crack, when the facade the clan had built for years began to rot from within, because darkness always leaks, no matter how tightly it is sealed, and the first leak came from a man who was never meant to question anything: Father Gilbert Horton. A quiet priest, a man shaped by routine prayer and pastoral duty, but destiny sometimes chooses the most unlikely vessel to expose what institutions fear to confront. It began with a confession from a frightened traveler, a woman whose voice trembled as she spoke of shadows moving near the Brousard property. Whispers carried on humid winds, and the haunting sense that someone had followed her family through the swamp. She escaped, but her husband and son were never seen again. Gilbert filed it away as sorrow, until several weeks later a young boy came forward bringing a shoe he had found near the same region, a small shoe, hand-stitched, clearly belonging to a child. Two unrelated stories, yet tied by the same geography, the same dread, and the same unspoken intuition that something in those woods was deliberately hunting. Gilbert walked the swamp path alone one heavy afternoon, carrying nothing but a lantern, a prayer book, and the weight of suspicion, and what he found that day did not just unsettle him, it unraveled the boundary between man and nightmare. Among the reeds he discovered scraps of fabric torn violently as if ripped from struggling bodies. He found hair tangled in low branches. He found toys half buried in the mud, and each object pulsed with a message he could not yet speak, a message that told him this was not the work of beasts. This was the work of hands. And as he ventured deeper, he sensed something watching, not animal, not spirit, but human presence, observing him with intelligent hunger. He left with shaking breath, knowing that the swamp was no longer a place of nature but a vault of unspoken crimes. For weeks the priest wrestled with his discovery, trying to convince himself he was mistaken, trying to reconcile the evidence with the mythic illusions the community had accepted for years. But truth festers when ignored, and Gilbert could not sleep, could not pray, could not focus without hearing the crying echoes of those missing families. He studied old parish records, cross-referenced disappearances, noted patterns, and saw for the first time the mathematical rhythm behind the chaos. One family every few months, always near the Brousard land, always swallowed by silence. Predation disguised as tragedy. Hunger disguised as misfortune. Murder disguised as mystery. And when the weight became too heavy for a single conscience, Gilbert made the choice that would shatter everything. He walked into the office of Sheriff Augustus Landry, carrying a leather bag full of objects that no longer allowed doubt. The first spark of truth had been lit and the inferno was about to begin. The wind over the Ozark Hills that night carried a sound no living ear could ever mistake, yet no one dared to claim they truly heard it. For the moment you confess the sound, you also confess that something out there still remembers you, something old, something buried, something that has been waiting since the first settler placed a single wooden step into these mountains and felt the earth shift beneath them as if the soil itself wanted to swallow their memory whole. This part of the record has always been missing from the official reports, but travelers who passed through the ridge in the winter of 1903 spoke of a strange glow drifting between the tree lines, a pale wandering shimmer like the reflection of lantern light on water. Yet there was no river near the ridge and no traveler claimed ownership of a lantern that could move without a hand to guide it. When locals were pressed, they finally admitted what they had been hiding for generations, a story whispered by their great-grandparents, a warning that no stranger was ever meant to repeat. They said the ridge was a threshold carved by something that arrived before maps existed, before cabins were raised, before boundaries were marked. They said the land was not empty when the settlers came, instead it was watching. On the night of the final disappearance, a farmhand named Carver Pike reported that he saw footprints along the frost, but the prints were not shaped like the foot of a man, nor an animal, nor any living thing he could name. They were long, winding, dragging, as if something heavy crawled forward on too many limbs to count, each impression sinking deeper than the last, as though the creature was pulling itself out from a grave it had not been buried in. Carver followed them only long enough to understand the truth. The prints did not lead into the forest they led out of it. Something had crossed the boundary and stepped into their world, something that left no scent, no breath, no reflection, and yet carried the unmistakable weight of hunger. The morning after his report, Carver Pike was gone, his door left open, his bedding still warm, his boots still placed neatly at the foot of the frame, but the strange dragging prints had returned, this time circling the home, looping around it again and again, tightening like a rope, preparing to claim its next name. The ridge was no longer watching, it was choosing. By dawn the people of the valley gathered outside Carver Pike's abandoned home, their breath rising in pale clouds, their faces drawn tight with the kind of fear that does not ask questions because the answers are already alive inside the mind, twisting, scratching, begging to be denied. The home stood untouched, the door swaying gently on its hinges as if an unseen hand still pushed it open and closed, repeating the last motion Carver ever made before something called him into the dark. His neighbors refused to step beyond the threshold, not because of what they expected to see but because of what they expected to feel. The moment they crossed inside, they believed the house remembered every scream that had never been heard, every breath that had been stolen, every moment when the living world had been peeled away like wet bark from a dying tree. The air inside was colder than the morning frost, yet the windows showed no break, the chimney held no draft. The cold was coming from somewhere deeper than the walls. One of the older men finally bent and placed a palm on the dirt just outside the frame, and his face tightened. He said the ground was pulsing, not moving, not shaking, pulsing as if a heart older than the mountain range lay beneath the soil, beating only when the land was hungry and stilling itself when it had fed. And every person present felt their lungs grow tight at the thought that the earth beneath their feet might be alive in ways they had never been taught to fear. When they gathered the courage to search the home, they found no blood, no sign of a struggle, no torn cloth, no displaced furniture, not even a mark of panic carved into the wood. And yet the house felt wrong, wrong the way an empty casket feels wrong when it has already been lowered into the ground, wrong the way an echo sounds wrong when it comes from a place with no walls to return it. It was the quiet that terrified them most, the absolute suffocating quiet, the kind that swallows sound rather than holds it, a quiet that felt like listening to the breath of something enormous waiting patiently just outside their understanding. A woman finally pointed to the floor near the back wall where the boards were bowed, not cracked, not warped, bowed, rising upward as though something beneath them had pressed from below and almost broken through. They stared at the shape and then at one another, and an unspoken truth passed through them like a tide. Whatever took Carver Pike did not come into the house. It rose into it. The air inside the Brousard cabin changed the moment they stepped over the splintered threshold. It thickened as if the walls themselves exhaled a slow, heavy breath that had been held for decades, waiting for a trespasser bold enough or foolish enough to cross inside. The silence felt swollen, like something living and wounded lurked just beyond the edges of human sight, and even the bravest men hesitated to take another step, as though the floor might swallow their weight and drag them into whatever memories the wood had absorbed across generations of violence, hunger, and forbidden kinship. The first thing they noticed was the smell, not rot, not death, not the stench of an animal left to decay, but something stranger and far older, a blend of iron, earth, and wet stone, like the breath of a cavern that no sunlight had touched in 1,000 years, a smell that felt deliberate, like it did not escape from the house but welcomed them into its center, inviting them deeper and whispering that they had already stayed too long to walk away untouched. A broken cradle sat in the corner, its rockers worn down on one side as if it had been pushed in uneven jolts by a hand that did not understand gentleness, and beside it lay several small carvings made from animal bone, each shaped into spiral symbols and twisting patterns that seemed to move when stared at too long, the kind of shapes that trick the mind into believing they hold instructions, ancient commands or warnings carved by someone who never learned language but understood hunger perfectly. One of the men bent to pick up a bone carving but froze when a gust of cold air brushed past his ankle, as if something small and invisible had scurried across the floor, fleeing into the shadows before human eyes could catch its motion, and he whispered that the cold did not feel like wind but like breath from something crouched too low to be seen, watching, waiting, measuring them. In the back of the room, the cracked plaster wall bore a strange smear, not blood, not ash, but a dark resin that glistened faintly in the dim light, forming a long uneven streak that ran from the ceiling to the floor, as though a hand dripping with the substance had dragged itself downward slowly, leaving behind a mark that pulsed with the memory of whoever made it. Then they heard it, a subtle rhythmic creaking coming from beneath the floorboards, not footsteps, not movement, but the slow patient sway of something that rocked itself in the dark, as if mimicking the cradle in the corner, practicing the motion, learning the gesture, repeating it again and again with the devotion of a creature that had been raised on silence. The Brousard cabin was not abandoned. It had simply been waiting. The swamp outside the Brousard property seemed to breathe in time with the wind weaving through the cypress knees like a chorus of hollow lungs, drawing life from the mud and decay. The fog clung to the water in thick blankets, hiding the surface as if the marsh itself wanted to conceal whatever truths lay beneath its dark skin. Hunters and travelers told stories of seeing shapes move in the mist, figures too tall or too hunched to be human gliding between the trees or vanishing into the water without a sound, and those who dared follow the tracks often returned silent, pale, and forever changed. The family's influence extended far beyond the crumbling walls of their cabin, as if the land itself had absorbed their ways. The animals of the swamp behaved differently. Raccoons and possums approached with unnatural boldness, deer lingered at the tree line longer than they should, and the birds fell silent whenever anyone passed near the old property. The swamp had become a living testament to the Brousard presence. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple in the water carried a memory of actions deliberate, cruel, and unimaginably efficient. Inside the cabin the furniture remained as if frozen mid-use, a table scarred with deep grooves from knives that had never been cleaned, the remnants of dried herbs and strange spices in cracked jars on the shelves, and the faint scent of smoked meat lingering in corners like a ghost of meals long consumed or prepared for sale. The walls bore the weight of years of planning, of methods perfected with almost obsessive care, meticulous record-keeping, invisible to the untrained eye but evident in the layout and the division of spaces into work areas, storage areas, and preparation areas. Investigators found small notes written in careful script by Cordelia detailing cuts and weights of meat, preservation times, and customer preferences. She had catalogued everything, every human meal planned as a merchant would catalog vegetables or livestock, and the precision was chilling. She even listed preferred cuts for children versus adults, gender and occupation influencing taste, texture, and profitability. The level of thought applied to each process suggested not only normalization but a sense of pride in the efficiency of their system. The swamp seemed to mock the investigators. Every footprint disappeared within hours, every set trap remained untouched, and the presence of something watching could be felt in every movement of air. The children had grown into this environment like fish in water, but even the adults' cruelty had shaped the land itself. The cypress trees bore witness, the mud remembered the steps of each victim and predator alike, and in the silence the story of the family echoed louder than any words could convey. Every night the wind through the branches carried whispers of the past. The fog rolled over the water like a curtain between two worlds, the living and the dead, and the investigators knew the swamp had become both prison and monument for a family whose methods were too systematic to dismiss and too horrific to fully comprehend. By 1906 the story of the Brousard family had spread beyond the immediate swamplands, whispers reaching neighboring parishes and towns, bringing fear and morbid fascination. No one truly understood how 14 people could orchestrate such a precise and systematic cycle of violence and consumption and yet live for years in the heart of isolation. Authorities struggled to contain the narrative. Journalists wrote in hushed tones describing horrors too detailed for polite conversation. The public recoiled but remained unable to look away, drawn to the grotesque choreography of life and death the family had perfected. Survivors among the children presented a puzzle both legal and moral, their conditioning so complete that even when removed from the environment they retained fragments of the family's twisted logic. Octave and Sidonie struggled with impulses ingrained from birth, their minds shaped to accept murder and consumption as essential to survival. Every new meal in the orphanage questioned why animal flesh was adequate while human meat was the superior choice. Dr. Manning observed with clinical horror as the children debated flavor, texture and method as if discussing seasonal vegetables or cuts of beef. The swamp itself seemed to participate in their story. Each visit of law enforcement or wandering traveler brought subtle reminders of the family's presence: hidden snares, rusted tools, partially buried bones that escaped detection for months, and the faint odor of decay that lingered longer than it should. The land had absorbed the rhythm of the family's work, every tree, branch and swampy knoll retaining the memory of the calculated steps of predator and prey, a silent archive of cruelty that no official report could fully convey. Investigators found evidence of meticulous planning everywhere, including maps of nearby roads and towns, notes on families considered vulnerable, and journals detailing the perceived efficiency of the operation. Everything pointed toward an intelligence applied to atrocity, a mind willing to rationalize cannibalism as both necessity and enterprise. The concept of morality appeared foreign, the notion of remorse non-existent. Each document a chilling reminder of how human ingenuity can be applied to the darkest ends. Even after the arrest and partial eradication of the family, the legend persisted. Locals spoke in hushed tones of sightings, figures moving in the fog, unexplained fires, or the glint of eyes in moonlit water. The swamp became a psychological trap, reminding anyone who entered that the line between survival and atrocity is far thinner than the comfort of civilization allows. The story of the Broussards had become part of the landscape of fear, an invisible architecture of dread woven into every tree and ripple of the water. By the summer of 1906, the Louisiana swamps had become a theater of fear and speculation. Reports of skeletal figures moving silently through the misty cypress forests unnerved fishermen, hunters, and occasional travelers, every sighting carrying the unspoken question of whether the remaining Brousard fugitives were hunting or merely surviving. The landscape itself seemed complicit with the family. Knowledge of hidden waterways, elevated platforms, and concealed shelters gave them a spectral advantage, allowing movement without detection, leaving only eerie signs of life and the occasional trace of violence. Authorities followed up on every lead with little success. The terrain was treacherous, thick mud, stagnant waters, and dense vegetation provided natural fortresses for anyone familiar with the land. The fugitive family members seemed to exploit this knowledge to evade capture entirely. Every footprint disappeared as soon as it was made, every fire carefully obscured, leaving only fragments of human activity as hints of their presence. Dr. Manning and Sheriff Landry speculated that isolation had not only preserved their survival skills but had hardened their willingness to do whatever was necessary, including violence against each other if resources dwindled. The analysis of remains found near improvised camps revealed evidence of cannibalism even among the fugitives themselves. Dr. Manning theorized that prolonged isolation and starvation could have forced them to turn on one another, a grim reflection of the operational logic that had governed the family for years. Even without Clamos or Cordelia in charge, the conditioning remained in place. Survival and consumption were inseparable, a final cruel demonstration of the psychological grip imposed since birth. Local communities avoided the swamps almost entirely. Rumors grew into myth. Reports of disembodied voices, strange shadows, and the metallic scent of decay created an invisible boundary. Locals respected the area, became a symbol of terror, a cautionary geography warning against curiosity and demonstrating that isolation combined with learned brutality could produce monstrous results far beyond any single generation. The swamps had swallowed the family's secrets but retained enough traces to haunt the collective imagination of the region. By the end of 1906, the pursuit of the remaining Broussards was officially abandoned. The harsh environment had effectively neutralized them, whether through starvation, disease, or internal conflict remains uncertain. Only fragments of evidence survived to suggest that the fugitives had maintained their system of survival at great cost. The swamp itself had become an accomplice, preserving a record of horror for those who dared enter or listen closely to the whispers of water, wind, and tree. In September of 1906, authorities returned to the Brousard property to enact a final measure. The swamps had held on to the family's secrets too long, and the decision was made to burn every structure, every remnant of their operation. The fire consumed wooden buildings, storage sheds, and animal pens, fueled not only by timber but by years of accumulated fat and waste. The flames burned with unnatural intensity, and the smoke carried a stench that lingered for kilometers around the neighboring communities. were forced to witness a conflagration that seemed to purge the land of memory, yet the soil itself retained traces of the horrors that had occurred there. The fire raged for 5 days, turning the isolated homestead into an unrecognizable ruin. Bones, fragments of tools and personal items surfaced in the flames as if the land itself was reluctant to let go. Each eruption of smoke became a grim symbol of the past. Authorities documented the destruction, but the local population remained hesitant to return. Even after the fire subsided, the swamp was avoided. Whispers of ghosts and lingering spirits of the victims discouraged any lingering curiosity and reinforced the legend of the Brousard family as a warning of what extreme isolation and learned depravity could produce. Even after the property was destroyed, floodwaters in 1907 and 1908 brought more evidence to the surface. Bones, personal artifacts and tools previously buried emerged from the softened earth, reminding the region that the memory of systematic horror could not be completely erased. Every flood renewed the community's fear and fascination, as if the swamp itself acted as a slow chronicler of the crimes that had occurred there. Dr. Manning continued his observations on these remains, using them to further study the effects of prolonged isolation and inbreeding on morality, cognition, and social behavior. Each fragment a testament to the consequences of an entirely self-contained system of brutality. The surviving Brousard children faced uncertain futures, placed in distant orphanages in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and beyond. Their lives were a mixture of victimhood and complicity. Dr. Manning's reports detailed severe psychological damage with ingrained patterns of cannibalistic normalcy. Octave and Sidonie struggled to comprehend that the actions they had been raised to see as virtuous were considered criminal. The twins Alice and Anatole presented even greater challenges, demonstrating violent behaviors and food obsessions that reflected their conditioning from birth. Little Azalee showed the rarest capacity for adaptation. Less exposed to the full extremity of family operations, she gradually absorbed social norms, religious teachings, and moral reasoning. Eventually adopted in 1912, she assumed a new identity and lived a life free from the immediate shadows of her upbringing. Yet she carried the weight of secrecy, never speaking of the swamp or her family's deeds, a living witness to what isolation and systematic conditioning could produce. In September of 1906, authorities returned to the Brousard property to enact a final measure. The swamps had held on to the family's secrets too long, and the decision was made to burn every structure, every remnant of their operation. The fire consumed wooden buildings, storage sheds, and animal pens, fueled not only by timber but by years of accumulated fat and waste. The flames burned with unnatural intensity, and the smoke carried a stench that lingered for kilometers around the neighboring communities. Were forced to witness a conflagration that seemed to purge the land of memory, yet the soil itself retained traces of the horrors that had occurred there. The fire raged for 5 days, turning the isolated homestead into an unrecognizable ruin. Bones, fragments of tools, and personal items surfaced in the flames as if the land itself was reluctant to let go. Each eruption of smoke became a grim symbol of the past. Authorities documented the destruction, but the local population remained hesitant to return. Even after the fire subsided, the swamp was avoided. Whispers of ghosts and lingering spirits of the victims discouraged any lingering curiosity and reinforced the legend of the Brousard family as a warning of what extreme isolation and learned depravity could produce. Even after the property was destroyed, floodwaters in 1907 and 1908 brought more evidence to the surface. Bones, personal artifacts, and tools previously buried emerged from the softened earth, reminding the region that the memory of systematic horror could not be completely erased. Every flood renewed the community's fear and fascination, as if the swamp itself acted as a slow chronicler of the crimes that had occurred there. Dr. Manning continued his observations on these remains, using them to further study the effects of prolonged isolation and inbreeding on morality, cognition, and social behavior. Each fragment a testament to the consequences of an entirely self-contained system of brutality. The surviving Brousard children faced uncertain futures, placed in distant orphanages in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and beyond. Their lives were a mixture of victimhood and complicity. Dr. Manning's reports detailed severe psychological damage with ingrained patterns of cannibalistic normalcy. Octave and Sidonie struggled to comprehend that the actions they had been raised to see as virtuous were considered criminal. The twins Alice and Anatole presented even greater challenges, demonstrating violent behaviors and food obsessions that reflected their conditioning from birth. Little Azalee showed the rarest capacity for adaptation. Less exposed to the full extremity of family operations, she gradually absorbed social norms, religious teachings and moral reasoning. Eventually adopted in 1912, she assumed a new identity and lived a life free from the immediate shadows of her upbringing, yet she carried the weight of secrecy, never speaking of the swamp or her family's deeds, a living witness to what isolation and systematic conditioning could produce. The story of the Brousard family remains a dark mirror reflecting the extremes of human adaptability and moral corruption. In isolation, the swamps of Louisiana still whisper their history to those who dare enter the dense cypress and moss-covered waterways. The efficient industrialized cannibalism that had functioned for 4 years, processing more than 10 victims per year, serves as a stark reminder that true horror does not always come from myth or legend, but from ordinary humans conditioned to normalize atrocity under the guise of survival and necessity. The repercussions of the case extended far beyond the immediate region. Trust in rural communities declined as merchants and travelers became wary of isolated households. The idea that a seemingly ordinary family could transform into a systematic killing machine challenged notions of safety and morality. Father Gilbert Horton, traumatized by what he witnessed, requested reassignment and recorded reflections warning of human potential for organized cruelty. Dr. Manning's research into cognitive and moral effects of inbreeding in extreme social isolation continued to influence psychological studies, highlighting how environment shapes ethical understanding and behavior. Sheriff Landry implemented new protocols ensuring that extreme isolation would never again allow crimes to flourish unnoticed. The complete erasure of the Brousard property in 1906 and subsequent floods in 1907 and 1908 revealed further remnants of the family's crimes, bones and personal effects surfacing as though the earth itself refused to hide what had occurred. The silence of the swamps became a repository of collective fear and unease. The surviving children struggled with identities fractured by years of conditioning and complicity, their fates tragic but instructive, illustrating how human morality can be eroded and reconstructed from birth under systematic indoctrination. Azalee's eventual integration into society under a new identity offers a rare glimmer of hope, yet the story remains a warning. The potential for human depravity exists wherever isolation, inbreeding and distorted moral reasoning intersect with opportunity and necessity. The case raises unanswerable questions about responsibility, culpability, and the fragility of social and ethical norms. How far can humans bend before losing their humanity entirely, and can such conditioning ever be reversed? In the hushed swamps where the Brousards once lived, the air still carries whispers of their calculated efficiency, the logic that equated people with animals, the entrepreneurial pride in cannibalism, and the systematic organization of murder. The story endures as a chilling testament to human potential for horror and adaptability, a reminder that civilization is a fragile construct and that under the right conditions, ordinary humans can create nightmares more terrifying than any fiction. If you wish to continue exploring the darkest corners of human history, subscribe and activate notifications for more stories that confront the uncomfortable truth of what humanity is capable of in isolation and under necessity.